I have often been asked how it was and through what series of steps that I became an opium eater. Was it gradually, tentatively, mistrustingly, as one goes down a shelving beach into a deepening sea, and with the knowledge from the first of the dangers lying on that path, half courting those dangers in fact, whilst seeming to defy them? Or was it, secondly, in pure ignorance of such dangers, under the misleadings of mercenary fraud? Thirdly and lastly, was it? Yes. By passionate anticipation, I answer before the question is finished. Was it on a sudden, overmastering impulse derived from bodily anguish? Loudly, I repeat, yes. Loudly and indignantly, as an answer to a wilful calumny. Not any search after pleasure, but mere extremity of pain from rheumatic toothache. This and nothing else it was that first drove me into the use of opium. Now, anyone, after a few moments' reflection, will perceive that whatever may have been the casual occasion of my opium eating, this could not have been the permanent ground of opium eating, because toothache is not an abiding affection of the system. It is an intermitting malady, and not at all capable of accounting for a permanent habit of opium eating. What was it that did in reality make me an opium eater? That affection which finally drove me into the habitual use of opium, what was it? Pain, was it? No, but misery. Casual overcasting of sunshine, was it? No, but blank desolation. Gloom, was it, that might have departed? No, but settled and abiding darkness. Total eclipse without all hope of day. Yet whence derived? Caused by what? Caused, as I might truly plead, by youthful distresses in London, were it not that these distresses were due in their ultimate origin to my own unpardonable folly, and to that folly I trace many ruins. Oh, heavens, that it should be possible for a child not 17 years old, by a momentary blindness, by listening to a false whisper from his own bewildered heart, by one erring step, by a motion this way or that, to change the currents of his destiny, to poison the fountains of his peace, and in the twinkling of an eye to lay the foundations of a lifelong repentance. Yet, alas, I must abide by the realities of the case. And one thing is clear, that amidst such bitter self-reproaches as are now extorted from me by the anguish of my recollections, it cannot be with any purpose of weaving plausible excuses or of evading blame that I trace the origin of my confirmed opium eating to a necessity growing out of my early sufferings in the streets of London. What really calls for excuse is not the recourse to opium, when opium had become the sole remedy available for the malady, but those follies which had themselves produced that malady. My father died when I was in my 7th year, leaving 6 children, including myself, to the care of 4 guardians and of our mother, who was invested with the legal authority of a guardian. I was 15 years old when my first introduction took place to the Manchester Grammar School. The schoolroom showed already, in its ample proportions, some hint of its pretensions as an endowed school, or school of that class which I believe peculiar to England. To this limited extent had the architectural sense of power been timidly and parsimoniously invoked. Beyond that, nothing had been attempted, and the dreary expanse of whitewashed walls that at so small a cost might have been embellished by plaster of Paris friezes and large medallions, illustrating to the eye of the youthful student the most memorable glorifications of literature, these were bare as the walls of a poorhouse or a lazaretto. The headmaster at that time was Mr. Charles Lawson. Mr. Lawson was in some degree interesting by his position and his recluse habits. Life was over with him, for its hopes and for its trials. Or at most, one trial yet awaited him. He still had his dying to do. He was in arrear as to that, else all was finished. Meantime, Mr. Lawson had sought his main consolation in the great classics of elder days. His senior alumni were always working their way through some great scenic poet that had shaken the stage of Athens. And more than one of his classes, never ending, still beginning, were daily solacing him with the gaieties of Horace in his epistles or in his satires. The Horatian jests, indeed, to him never grew old. I returned to my own inaugural examination. Mr. Lawson produced from his desk a volume of the Spectator, and instructed me to throw into as good Latin as I could some paper of Steele's. Not the whole, but perhaps a third part. No better exercise could have been devised for testing the extent of my skill as a Latinist. And here I ought to make an explanation. Neither in Greek nor in Latin was my knowledge very extensive. My age made that impossible, and especially because in those days there were no decent guides through the thorny jungles of the Latin language, far less of the Greek. But I succeeded, and beyond my expectation. For once, being the first time that he'd been known to do such a thing, but also the very last, Mr. Lawson did absolutely pay me a compliment, and with another compliment more than verbal, he crowned his gracious condescensions with my provisional installment in his highest class. 2 or 3 days after this examination, I transferred myself to headquarters at Mr. Lawson's house. About 9 o'clock in the evening, I was conducted by a servant up a short flight of stairs, through a series of gloomy and unfurnished little rooms, having small windows but no doors, to the common room of the senior boys. Everything had combined to depress me. To leave the society of accomplished women, that was already a signal privation. The season, besides, was rainy, which in itself is a sure source of depression, and the forlorn aspect of the rooms completed my dejection. But the scene changed as the door was thrown open. Faces, kindling with animation, became visible, and from a company of boys, numbering 16 or 18, scattered about the room, 2 or 3, whose age entitled them to the rank of leaders, came forward to receive me with a courtesy I had not looked for. The grave kindness and the absolute sincerity of their manner impressed me most favorably. One of the young men, noticing my state of dejection, brought out some brandy, a form of alcohol which I, for my part, tasted now for the first time, having previously taken only wine, and never once in quantities to affect my spirits. So much the greater was my astonishment at the rapid change worked in my state of feeling, a change which at once reinstalled me in my natural advantages for conversation. Oh, wherefore, then, was it, through what inexplicable growth of evil in myself or in others, that now, in the summer of 1802, when peace was brooding over all the land, peace succeeding to a bloody 7 years' war, but peace which already gave signs of breaking into a far bloodier war, some dark, sympathizing movement within my own heart, as if echoing and repeating in mimicry the political menaces of the earth, swept with storm clouds across that otherwise serene and radiant dawn, which should have heralded my approaching entrance into life. Inexplicable, I have allowed myself to call this fatal error in my life, because such it must appear to others. Yet again, in simple truth, there really was no absolute mystery at all. Mr. Lawson was gradually becoming a curse to all who fell under his influence, through pure zealotry of conscientiousness. If he could have reconciled himself to an imperfect discharge of his duties, he would not have betrayed his insufficiency for those duties, but this he would not hear of. He persisted in travelling over the appointed course to the last inch, and the consequences told most painfully upon the comfort of all around him. The bread and milk which composed our simple breakfast were dispatched at a pace fitter for the fowls of the air than students of Grecian philosophy. 2 or 3 chance intervals of 5 minutes each, and even these not consecutively arranged, composed the whole available fund of leisure, out of which any stroll into the country could have been attempted. The change showed itself powerfully in my drooping health. Gradually the liver became affected, and connected with that affection arose, what often accompanies such ailments, profound melancholy. In such circumstances, indeed, under any the slightest disturbance of my health, I had authority from my guardians to call for medical advice, but I was not left to my own discretion in selecting the adviser. This person was not a physician, who would of course have expected the ordinary fee of a guinea for every visit, nor a surgeon, but simply an apothecary. In any case of serious illness, a physician would have been called in, but a less costly style of advice was reasonably held to be sufficient in any illness which left the patient strength sufficient to walk about. Unhappily, my professional adviser was a comatose old gentleman, rich beyond all his needs, careless of his own practice, and standing under that painful necessity of seeking his remuneration in excessive deluges of medicine. Me, however, out of pure idleness, he forbore to plague with any variety of medicines. With sublime simplicity he confined himself to one horrid mixture that must have suggested itself to him when prescribing for a tiger. In ordinary circumstances and with plenty of exercise, no creature could be healthier than myself. But my organization was perilously frail, and to fight simultaneously with such a malady and such a medicine seemed really too much. Hope died within me. I could not look for medical relief, so deep being my own ignorance, so equally deep being that of my official counselor. I could not expect that Mr. Lawson would modify his system, his instincts of duty being so strong, his incapacity to face that duty so steadily increasing. It comes then to this, thought I, that in myself only there lurks any area of help. In the twinkling of an eye I came to an adamantine resolution that I would elope from Manchester. To go was settled, but when and whither? When could have but one answer, for on more reasons than one I needed summer weather, and as much of it as possible. Besides that, when August came, it would bring along with it my own birthday. Now, one codicil in my general vow of freedom had been that my 17th birthday should not find me at school. Still, I needed some trifle of preparation, especially I needed a little money. I wrote, therefore, to the only confidential friend that I had, Lady Carberry. Lady Carberry, a young woman some 10 years older than myself, thought too highly of my powers and attainments, and everywhere spoke of me with an enthusiasm that, if I had been 5 or 6 years older and had possessed any personal advantages, might have raised smiles at her expense. To her I now wrote, requesting the loan of 5 guineas. A whole week passed without any answer. This perplexed and made me uneasy. Why, but at that moment my speculations were cut short by a letter bearing a coroneted seal. It was from Lady Carberry, of course, and enclosed 10 guineas instead of 5. Slow in those days were the mails, besides which Lady Carberry happened to be down at the seaside, whither my letter had been sent after her. And now all things were settled except one. The when was settled and the how, but not the whither. That was still sub judice. My plan originally had been to travel northwards to the region of the English lakes. There had by that time arisen in this lovely region the deep, deep magnet of William Wordsworth. Inevitably this close connection of the poetry which most of all had moved me with the particular region and scenery that most of all had fastened upon my affections and led captive my imagination was calculated, under ordinary circumstances, to impress upon my fluctuating deliberations a summary and decisive bias. But under my present circumstances I saw that the very motives of love and honour, which would have inclined the scale so powerfully in favour of the northern lakes, were exactly those which drew most heavily in the other direction. And just at that moment suddenly unveiled itself another powerful motive against taking the northern direction, consideration for my mother, which made my heart recoil from giving her too great a shock. And in what other way could it be mitigated than by my personal presence in a case of emergency? I resolved to steer a course for St. John's Priory, my mother's residence near Chester. It happened that a maternal uncle, a military man on the Bengal establishment, was at this time a visitor at the Priory. My dear excellent mother, from the eternal quiet of her decorous household, looked upon every violent or irregular movement, and therefore upon mine at present, much as she would have done upon the opening of the 7th seal in the Revelations. But my uncle was thoroughly a man of the world. It was so exquisitely natural in his eyes that any rational person should prefer moving about the breezy mountains of Wales to a slavish routine of study among books grim with dust, and masters, too, probably still more dusty, that he seemed disposed to regard my conduct as an extraordinary act of virtue. On his advice it was decided that there could be no hope in any contest with my main wishes, and that I should be left to pursue my original purpose of walking amongst the Welsh mountains, provided I chose to do so upon the slender allowance of a guinea a week. My uncle would gladly have had a far larger allowance made to me, and would himself have clandestinely given me anything I asked. But I myself, from general ignorance, in which accomplishment I excelled, judged this to be sufficient. And at this point my mother, hitherto passively acquiescent in my uncle's proposals, interfered with the decisive rigour that in my own heart I could not disapprove. Any larger allowance, most reasonably, she urged. What was it but to make proclamation to my two younger brothers that rebellion bore a premium, and that mutiny was the ready road to ease and comfort? My mother was predisposed to think ill of all causes that required many words. I, predisposed to subtleties of all sorts and degrees, had naturally become acquainted with cases that could not unrobe their apparellings down to that degree of simplicity. If in this world there is one misery having no relief, it is the pressure on the heart from the incommunicable. At this moment, sitting in the same room with my mother, knowing how reasonable she was, how patient of explanations, how candid, how open to pity, not the less I sank away in a hopelessness that was immeasurable from all effort at explanation. I felt that the situation was one without hope. A solitary word which I attempted to mould upon my lips died away into a sigh. One alternative in the offer made to me was that I had permission to stay at the Priory. I knew my mother sufficiently to be assured that, once having expressed her sorrowful condemnation of my act, having made it impossible for me to misunderstand her views, she was ready to extend her wonted hospitality to me, and, as regarded all practical matters, her wonted kindness. But not that sort of kindness which could make me forget that I stood under the deepest shadows of her displeasure, or could leave me for a moment free to converse at my ease upon any and every subject. A man that is talking on simple toleration, and as it were under permanent protest, cannot feel himself morally at his ease, unless very obtuse and coarse in his sensibilities. Besides, any mother who is a widow has especial claims on the cooperation of her eldest son in all means of giving a beneficial bias to the thoughts and purposes of the younger children. And if any mother, then by a title how special could my own mother invoke such cooperation, who had on her part satisfied all the claims made upon her maternal character by self-sacrifices as varied as privately I knew them to be exemplary. Alas, too certainly as regarded that duty I felt my own failure. I resolved to avail myself of those wild mountains and sylvan attractions which at present lay nearest to me. There were already, even in those days of 1802, numerous inns, erected at reasonable distances from each other for the accommodation of tourists. Happier life I cannot imagine than this vagrancy, if the weather were but tolerable, through endless successions of changing beauty, and towards evening a courteous welcome in a pretty rustic home, that, having all the luxuries of a fine hotel, was at the same time liberated from the inevitable accompaniments of such hotels in great cities, or great travelling stations, the tumult and uproar. But what did it cost? About half a guinea a day, whilst my boyish allowance was not a third of this. Perquisites to servants and a bed would have absorbed the whole of my weekly guinea. My policy therefore was, if the autumnal air were warm enough, to save this expense of a bed and the chambermaid by sleeping amongst ferns or firs upon a hillside. I tried for some weeks the plan of carrying a canvas tent manufactured by myself, and not larger than an ordinary umbrella. But to pitch this securely I found difficult, and on windy nights it became a troublesome companion. Still, one may bivouac decently, barring rain and wind, up to the end of October, and I counted on the whole that in a fortnight I spent 9 nights abroad. There are no jaguars in Wales, nor pumas, nor anacondas, nor, generally speaking, any thugs. What I feared most, but perhaps only through ignorance of zoology, was lest, whilst my sleeping face was upturned to the stars, some one of the many little Brahminical-looking cows on the Cambrian hills, one or other, might poach her foot into the centre of my face. Just when it was becoming daily more difficult to eke out the weekly funds for high-priced inns by the bivouacking system, I took a fierce resolution to sacrifice my weekly allowance, to slip my anchor, and to throw myself in desperation upon London. With a more extended knowledge of life than I had at that time, it would not have been so hopeless a speculation for a boy having my accomplishments to launch himself on the boundless ocean of London. I possessed attainments that bore a money value. For instance, as a reader to the press in the field of Greek republications, I might perhaps have earned a livelihood. But these chances which I really had never occurred to me in the light of useful resources, and those which I chiefly relied on were most unlikely to prove available. I lost no time in opening the business which had brought me to London. By 10 a.m., an hour when all men of business are presumed to be at their posts, personally or by proxy, I presented myself at the money-lender's office. The money-lender, as it turned out, had one fixed rule of action. He never granted a personal interview to any man, no, not to the most beloved of his clients. One and all, myself therefore among the crowd, he referred for information and for the means of prosecuting any kind of negotiation to an attorney by the name of Brunel. How beneficial to me would a little candour have been at that early period. If I had been told that nothing would be brought to a close in less than 6 months, even assuming the ultimate adoption of my proposals, I should from the first have dismissed all hopes of this nature as being unsuited to the practicabilities of my situation. As it was, I continued for 7 or 8 weeks to live most parsimoniously in lodgings. These lodgings, though barely decent in my eyes, ran away with at the least 2/3 of my remaining guineas. At length, whilst it was yet possible to reserve a solitary half-guinea towards the more urgent interest of finding daily food, I gave up my rooms and, stating exactly the circumstances in which I stood, requested permission of Mr. Brunel to make use of his large house as a nightly asylum from the open air. Parliament had not then made it a crime, next door to a felony, for a man to sleep out of doors, as some 20 years later was done by our benign legislators. As yet, that was no crime. Lawful as yet this was, but not, therefore, less full of misery. Naturally, then, I was delighted when Mr. Brunel most readily assented to my request. I now regretted that I had not, at a much earlier period, applied for this liberty, since I might thus have saved a considerable fund of guineas, applicable, of course, to all urgent necessities, but at this particular moment to one of clamorous urgency, viz., the purchase of blankets. How feelingly I learned at this time, as heretofore I had learned on the wild hillsides in Wales, what an unspeakable blessing is that of warmth. A more killing curse there does not exist for man or woman than that bitter combat between the weariness that prompts sleep and the keen, searching cold that forces you from the first access of sleep to start up horror-stricken and to seek warmth vainly in renewed exercise, though long since fainting under fatigue. Being myself at that time of necessity a peripatetic, or a walker of the streets, I naturally fell in more frequently with those female peripatetics, who are technically called street walkers. Some of these women had occasionally taken my part against watchmen who wished to drive me off the steps of houses where I was sitting. Others had protected me against more serious aggressions. But to one amongst them, Anne, I owe it that I am at this time alive. For many weeks I had walked at nights with this poor friendless girl up and down Oxford Street, or had rested with her on steps and under the shelter of porticos. She had not completed her 16th year. Hers was a case of ordinary occurrence, as I have since had reason to think, and one in which, if London beneficence had better adapted its arrangements to meet it, the power of the law might oftener be interposed to protect and to avenge. I saw that part of her injuries might have been redressed, and I urged her often and earnestly to lay her complaint before a magistrate. Friendless as she was, I assured her that she would meet with immediate attention, and that English justice, which was no respecter of persons, would speedily and amply avenge her on the brutal ruffian who had plundered her little property. She promised me often that she would, but she delayed taking the steps I pointed out from time to time, for she was timid and dejected to a degree which showed how deeply sorrow had taken hold of her young heart. And perhaps she thought justly that the most upright judge and the most righteous tribunals could do nothing to repair her heaviest wrongs. One night, when we were pacing slowly along Oxford Street, and after a day when I had felt unusually ill and faint, I requested her to turn off with me into Soho Square. Thither we went, and we sat down on the steps of her house. Suddenly, as we sat, I grew much worse. I had been leaning my head against her bosom, and all at once I sank from her arms and fell backwards on the steps. Uttering a cry of terror, but without a moment's delay, she ran off into Oxford Street, and in less time than could be imagined, returned to me with a glass of port wine and spices that acted upon my empty stomach, which at that time would have rejected all solid food, with an instantaneous power of restoration. And for this glass the generous girl, without a murmur, paid out of her own humble purse, at a time, be it remembered, when she had scarcely wherewithal to purchase the bare necessaries of life, and when she could have no reason to expect that I should ever be able to reimburse her. Soon after the period of the last incident, one of my friends agreed to furnish £200 or £300 on my personal security, provided I could persuade one of my noble friends, who was, by the way, not older than myself, to guarantee the payment on our joint coming of age. In pursuance of this proposal, I prepared to visit Eton. I had told Anne of my plans some time before, and now I assured her again that she should share in my good fortune, if I met with any, and that I would never forsake her as soon as I had power to protect her. This I fully intended, as much from inclination as from a sense of duty. I hoped to return in a week, at furthest, and I agreed with her that on the 5th night from that, and every night afterwards, she should wait for me at 6 o'clock near the bottom of Great Titchfield Street, which had formerly been our customary haven of rendezvous, to prevent our missing each other in the great Mediterranean of Oxford Street. This and other measures of precaution I took. One only I forgot. She had either never told me, or, as a matter of no great interest, I had forgotten her surname. When I reached the Gloucester Coffee House in Piccadilly, the Bristol mail was on the point of going off, and I mounted on the outside. For the first 4 or 5 miles out of London, I annoyed my fellow passenger on the roof by occasionally falling against him when the coach gave a lurch, and indeed, if the road had been less smooth and level than it was, I should have fallen off from weakness. Of this annoyance he complained heavily, as perhaps in the circumstances most people would. He expressed his complaint, however, more morosely than the occasion seemed to warrant. Still, I was conscious that I had given him some cause for complaint, and therefore I apologized, and at the same time I explained to him that I was ill, and in a weak state from long suffering, and that I could not afford to take an inside place. The man's manner changed upon hearing this explanation in an instant, and when I next woke for a minute, for in spite of my efforts I had again fallen asleep within 2 minutes, I found that he'd put his arm round me to protect me from falling off. So genial and refreshing was my sleep, being in the open air, that upon the sudden pulling up of the mail, I found that we had reached some place 6 or 7 miles to the west of Salt Hill. I immediately moved forward on foot. There had been, some weeks before, a murder committed on Hounslow Heath. Every step of my regress, for now I walked with my face towards London, was bringing me nearer to the Heath. And it naturally occurred to me that I and the accursed murderer, if he were that night abroad, might at every instant be unconsciously approaching each other through the darkness. In which case, said I, supposing myself, instead of being little better than an outcast, lord of my learning and no land beside, like my friend, the heir by general repute to £30,000 per annum, what a panic should I be under at this moment about my throat! Vast power and possessions make a man shamefully afraid of dying. In the road between Slough and Eton I fell asleep, and just as the morning began to dawn I was awakened by the voice of a man standing over me. I know not what he was. He was an ill-looking fellow, but not therefore of necessity an ill-meaning fellow, or if he were, I suppose he thought that no person sleeping out of doors in winter could be worth robbing. I was not sorry at his disturbance, as it roused me to pass through Eton before people were generally astir. The night had been heavy and misty, but towards the morning it had changed to a slight frost, and the trees were now covered with rime. On my road I met some junior boys, of whom I made inquiries. An Etonian is always a gentleman, and in spite of my shabby habiliments they answered me civilly. I asked for the Earl of Desart, on whom I called. Lord Desart placed before me a magnificent breakfast. It was really such. But in my eyes it seemed trebly magnificent, from being the first regular meal, the first good man's table that I had sat down to for months. Strange to say, I could scarcely eat anything. My appetite was utterly gone, and I nauseated food of every kind. I had, however, unfortunately, at all times a craving for wine. I explained my situation, therefore, to Lord Desart, and gave him a short account of my late sufferings, with which he expressed a deep sympathy and called for wine. This gave me instantaneous relief and immoderate pleasure, and on all occasions when I had an opportunity I never failed to drink wine. I was reluctant to ask Lord Desart the particular service in quest of which I had come to Eton. I was, however, unwilling to lose my journey, and I asked it. After a little consideration, he promised, under certain conditions which he pointed out, to give his security. Recomforted by this promise, which was not quite equal to the best, but far above the worst that I had anticipated, I returned in a Windsor coach to London 3 days after I had quitted it. Many delays were made, time passed on, the small fragment of my banknote had just melted away, and before any conclusion could have been put to the business, I must have relapsed into my former state of wretchedness. Suddenly, at this crisis, an opening was made, almost by accident, for reconciliation with my guardians. I returned to the Priory. After some time, I proceeded to Oxford, and it was not until many months had passed away that I had it in my power again to revisit the ground which had become so interesting to me, and to this day remains so, as the chief scene of my youthful sufferings. Meantime, what had become of Anne? Where was she? I sought her daily, and waited for her every night so long as I stayed in London at the corner of Titchfield Street. I put into activity every means of tracing her that my knowledge of London suggested. The street where she had lodged I knew, but not the house. All was in vain. To this hour I have never heard a syllable about her. This, amongst such troubles as most men meet with in this life, has been my heaviest affliction. It is very long since I first took opium, so long that if it had been a trifling incident in my life I might have forgotten its date, but cardinal events are not to be forgotten. From an early age I had been accustomed to wash my head in cold water at least once a day. Being suddenly seized with toothache, I attributed it to some relaxation caused by a casual intermission of that practice, jumped out of bed, plunged my head into a basin of cold water, and with hair thus wetted, went to sleep. The next morning, as I need hardly say, I awoke with excruciating rheumatic pains of the head and face, from which I had hardly any respite for about 20 days. On the 21st day, I think it was, and on a Sunday, that I went out into the streets, rather to run away, if possible, from my torments than with any distinct purpose of relief. By accident, I met a college acquaintance who recommended opium. Opium, dread agent of unimaginable pleasure and pain. I had heard of it as I had heard of manna or of ambrosia, but no further. How unmeaning a sound was opium at that time! What solemn chords does it now strike upon my heart! What heart-quaking vibrations of sad and happy remembrances! I saw a druggist's shop. The druggist, unconscious minister of celestial pleasures, as if in sympathy with the rainy Sunday, looked dull and stupid, just as any mortal druggist might be expected to look on a rainy London Sunday. And when I asked for the tincture of opium, he gave it to me as any other man might do, and furthermore, out of my shilling, returned to me what seemed to be a real copper halfpence, taken out of a real wooden drawer. Nevertheless, and notwithstanding all such indications of humanity, he has ever since figured in my mind as a beatific vision of an immortal druggist, sent down to earth on a special mission to myself. Arrived at my lodgings, it may be supposed that I lost not a moment in taking the quantity prescribed. I was necessarily ignorant of the whole art and mystery of opium-taking, and what I took under every disadvantage, but I took it. And in an hour, oh heavens, what a revulsion, what a resurrection from its lowest depths of the inner spirit. What an apocalypse of the world within me! That my pains had vanished was now a trifle in my eyes. This negative effect was swallowed up in the immensity of those positive effects which had opened before me, in the abyss of divine enjoyment thus suddenly revealed. Here was a panacea, a pharmacon nepenthes for all human woes. Here was the secret of happiness, about which philosophers had disputed for so many ages, at once discovered. Happiness might now be bought for a penny and carried in the waistcoat pocket. Portable ecstasies might be had corked up in a pint bottle, and peace of mind could be sent down by the mail. The pleasure given by wine is always rapidly mounting and tending to a crisis, after which as rapidly it declines. That from opium, when once generated, is stationary for 8 or 10 hours. The one is a flickering flame, the other a steady and equable glow. But the main distinction lies in this, that whereas wine disorders the mental faculties, opium, on the contrary, if taken in a proper manner, introduces amongst them the most exquisite order, legislation, and harmony. Wine robs a man of his self-possession. Opium sustains and reinforces it. Wine unsettles the judgment and gives a preternatural brightness and a vivid exaltation to the contempts and the admirations, to the loves and the hatreds of the drinker. Opium, on the contrary, communicates serenity and equipoise to all the faculties, active or passive. Opium, like wine, gives an expansion to the heart and the benevolent affections, but then with this remarkable difference, that in the sudden development of kind-heartedness which accompanies inebriation, there is always more or less of a maudlin and a transitory character, which exposes it to the contempt of the bystander. Men shake hands, swear eternal friendship, and shed tears, no mortal knows why, and the animal nature is clearly uppermost. But the expansion of the benigner feelings incident to opium is no febrile access, no fugitive paroxysm. It is a healthy restoration to that state which the mind would naturally recover upon the removal of any deep-seated irritation from pain that had disturbed and quarrelled with the impulses of a heart originally just and good. It is most absurdly said in popular language of any man that he is disguised in liquor. For, on the contrary, most men are disguised by sobriety, and exceedingly disguised. And it is when they are drinking that men display themselves in their true complexion of character. But still, wine, beyond a certain point, is sure to disperse the intellectual energies, whereas opium always seems to compose what had been agitated, and to concentrate what had been distracted. In short, a man who is inebriated or tending to inebriation is, and feels that he is, in a condition which calls up into supremacy the merely human, too often the brutal, part of his nature. But the opium eater feels that the diviner part of his nature is paramount. That is, the moral affections are in a state of cloudless serenity, and high over all the great light of the majestic intellect. The late Duke of Norfolk used to say, "Next Monday, wind and weather permitting, I purpose to be drunk." And in like manner, I used to fix beforehand how often within a given time, when, and with what accessory circumstances of festal joy, I would commit a debauch of opium. This was seldom more than once in 3 weeks, for at that time I could not have ventured to call every day, as afterwards I did, for a glass of laudanum negus, warm and without sugar. No, once in 3 weeks sufficed, and the time selected was either a Tuesday or a Saturday night. Tuesday and Saturday were the regular opera nights, and I used often on Saturday nights, after I'd taken opium, to wander forth, without much regarding the direction or the distance, to all the markets and other parts of London, whither the poor resort on a Saturday night for laying out their wages. Many a family party, consisting of a man, his wife, and sometimes one or two of their children, have I listened to as they stood consulting on their ways and means, or the strength of their exchequer, or the price of household articles. Whenever I saw occasion, or could do it without appearing to be intrusive, I joined their parties, and gave my opinion upon the matter in discussion, which, if not always judicious, was always received indulgently. If wages were a little higher, or were expected to be so, if the quartern loaf were a little lower, or it was reported that onions and butter were falling, I was glad. Yet, if the contrary were true, I drew from opium some means of consolation. Some of these rambles led me to great distances, for an opium eater is too happy to observe the motion of time, and sometimes in my attempts to steer homewards upon nautical principles by fixing my eye on the pole star and seeking ambitiously for a northwest passage, instead of circumnavigating all the capes and headlands I had doubled in my outward voyage, I came suddenly upon such knotty problems of alleys without soundings, such enigmatical entries, and such sphinxes riddles of streets without obvious outlets or thoroughfares, as must baffle the audacity of porters and confound the intellects of hackney coachmen. Yet in candour I will admit that markets and theatres are not the appropriate haunts of the opium eater when in the divinest state incident to his enjoyment. In that state crowds become an oppression to him, music even too sensual and gross. He naturally seeks solitude and silence as indispensable conditions of those trances or profoundest reveries which are the crown and consummation of what opium can do for human nature. As yet I had been only a dilettante eater of opium. Even 8 years' practice, with the single precaution of allowing sufficient intervals between every indulgence, has not been sufficient to make opium necessary to me as an article of daily diet. But now comes a different era. I was attacked by a most appalling irritation of the stomach, in all respects the same as that which had caused me so much suffering in youth, and accompanied by a revival of all the old dreams. Now, then, it was, in the year 1813, that I became a regular and confirmed, no longer an intermitting opium eater, of whom to ask whether on any particular day he had or had not taken opium would be to ask whether his lungs had performed respiration or the heart fulfilled its functions. The main phenomenon by which opium expressed itself permanently, and the sole phenomenon that was communicable, lay in the dreams, and in the peculiar dream scenery which followed the opium excesses. But naturally these dreams and this dream scenery drew their outlines and materials, their great lights and shadows, from those profound revelations which had been ploughed so deeply into the heart, from those encaustic records which in the mighty furnaces of London life had been burned into the undying memory by the fierce action of misery. The dreams were an inheritance from the opium. The opium was an inheritance from the boyish follies. My studies have now been long interrupted. I cannot read to myself with any pleasure, hardly with a moment's endurance. Yet I sometimes read aloud for the pleasure of others, because reading is an accomplishment of mine, and in the slang use of the word accomplishment as a superficial and ornamental attainment, almost the only one I possess. And formerly, if I had any vanity at all connected with any endowment or attainment of mine, it was with this, for I had observed that no accomplishment is more rare. Actors are the worst readers of all. Neither Coleridge nor Southey is a good reader of verse. Southey is admirable almost in all things, but not in this. Both he and Coleridge read as if crying, or at least wailing lugubriously. People in general either read poetry without any passion at all, or else overstep the modesty of nature. Wordsworth, by the by, is the only poet I ever met who could read his own verses. Often, indeed, he reads admirably. For nearly 2 years I believed that I read nothing and studied nothing. But for misery and suffering I might indeed be said to have existed in a dormant state. I seldom could prevail on myself to write a letter, An answer of a few words to any that I received was the utmost that I could accomplish, and often that was not until the letter had lain for weeks or even months on my writing table. The opium eater loses none of his moral sensibilities or aspirations. He wishes and longs as earnestly as ever to realize what he believes possible and feels to be exacted by duty. But his intellectual apprehension of what is possible infinitely outruns his power, not of execution only, but even of proposing or willing. He lies under a world's weight of incubus and nightmare. He lies in sight of all that he would fain perform, just as a man forcibly confined to his bed by the mortal languor of paralysis, who is compelled to witness injury or outrage offered to some object of his tenderest love. He would lay down his life if he might but rise and walk, but he is powerless as an infant, and cannot so much as make an effort to move. But from this I now pass to the history and journal of what took place in my dreams, for these were the immediate and proximate cause of shadowy terrors that settled and brooded over my whole waking life. The first notice I had of any important change going on in this part of my physical economy was from the reawaking of a state of eye, oftentimes incident to childhood. Many children have a power of painting, as it were, upon the darkness, all sorts of phantoms. In some, that power is simply a mechanic affection of the eye. Others have a voluntary or semi-voluntary power to dismiss or summon such phantoms. Or, as a child once said to me when I questioned him on this matter, "I can tell them to go, and they go, but sometimes they come when I don't tell them to come." This faculty became increasingly distressing to me. At night, when I lay awake in bed, vast processions moved along continually in mournful pomp, friezes of never-ending stories that to my feelings were as sad and solemn as stories drawn from times before Oedipus or Priam, before Tyre, before Memphis. And concurrently with this, a corresponding change took place in my dreams. A theatre seemed suddenly opened and lighted up within my brain, which presented nightly spectacles of more than earthly splendor. As the creative state of the eye increased, a sympathy seemed to arise between the waking and the dreaming states of the brain in one point, that whatsoever I happened to call up and to trace by a voluntary act upon the darkness was very apt to transfer itself to my dreams. And at length I feared to exercise this faculty. For as Midas turned all things to gold that yet baffled his hopes and defrauded his human desires, so whatsoever things capable of being visually represented I did but think of in the darkness, immediately shaped themselves into phantoms for the eye. And by a process apparently no less inevitable, when thus once traced in faint and visionary colors, like writings in sympathetic ink, they were drawn out by the fierce chemistry of my dreams into insufferable splendor that fretted my heart. This and all other changes in my dreams were accompanied by deep-seated anxiety and funereal melancholy, such as are wholly incommunicable by words. I seemed every night to descend, not metaphorically, but literally to descend into chasms and sunless abysses, depths below depths, from which it seemed hopeless that I could ever reascend. Nor did I, by waking, feel that I had ascended. Why should I dwell upon this? For indeed the state of gloom which attended these gorgeous spectacles, amounting at last to utter darkness, as of some suicidal despondency, cannot be approached by words. The sense of space, and in the end the sense of time, were both powerfully affected. Buildings, landscapes, etc., were exhibited in proportions so vast as the bodily eye is not fitted to receive. Space swelled and was amplified to an extent of unutterable and self-repeating infinity. This disturbed me very much less than the vast expansion of time. Sometimes I seemed to have lived for 70 or 100 years in one night. nay, sometimes had feelings representative of a duration far beyond the limits of any human experience. The minutest incidents of childhood, or forgotten scenes of later years, were often revived. I could not be said to recollect them, for if I had been told of them when waking, I should not have been able to acknowledge them as parts of my past experience. But placed as they were before me in dreams like intuitions, and clothed in all their evanescent circumstances and accompanying feelings, I recognized them instantly. Many years ago, when I was looking over Piranesi's Antiquities of Rome, Coleridge, then standing by, described to me a set of plates from that artist called his Dreams, and which record the scenery of his own visions during the delirium of a fever. Some of these, I describe only from memory of Coleridge's account, represented vast Gothic halls, on the floor of which stood mighty engines and machinery, wheels, gables, catapults, etc., expressive of enormous power put forth or resistance overcome. Creeping along the sides of the walls, you perceived a staircase, and upon this, groping his way upwards, was Piranesi himself. Follow the stairs a little further, and you perceive them reaching an abrupt termination, without any balustrade, and allowing no step onwards to him who should reach the extremity, except into the depth below. Whatever is to become of poor Piranesi, at least you suppose that his labours must now in some way terminate. But raise your eyes, and behold a second flight of stairs, still higher, on which again Piranesi is perceived, by this time standing on the very brink of the abyss. Once again elevate your eye, and a still more aerial flight of stairs is descried. And there again is the delirious Piranesi, busy on his aspiring labours, and so on, until the unfinished stairs and the hopeless Piranesi both are lost in the upper gloom of the hall. With the same power of endless growth and self-reproduction did my architecture proceed in dreams. In the early stage of the malady, the splendours of my dreams were indeed chiefly architectural, and I beheld such pomp of cities and palaces as never yet was beheld by the waking eye, unless in the clouds. To my architecture succeeded dreams of lakes and silvery expanses of water. These haunted me so much that I feared lest some dropsical state or tendency of the brain might thus be making itself, to use a metaphysical word, objective, and that the sentient organ might be projecting itself as its own object. For 2 months I suffered greatly in my head, a part of my bodily structure which had hitherto been so clear from all touch or taint of weakness, physically I mean, that I used to say of it, as the last Lord Orford said of his stomach, that it seemed likely to survive the rest of my person. Till now I had never felt a headache even, or any the slightest pain, except rheumatic pains caused by my own folly. The waters gradually changed their character. From translucent lakes, shining like mirrors, they became seas and oceans. And now came a tremendous change, which, unfolding itself slowly like a scroll through many months, promised an abiding torment. And, in fact, it never left me, though recurring more or less intermittingly. Hitherto the human face had often mixed in my dreams, but not despotically, nor with any special power of tormenting. But now that affection which I have called the tyranny of the human face began to unfold itself. Perhaps some part of my London life, the searching for Anne amongst fluctuating crowds, might be answerable for this. Be that as it may, now it was that upon the rocking waters of the ocean the human face began to reveal itself. The sea appeared paved with innumerable faces, upturned to the heavens, faces imploring, wrathful, despairing, faces that surged upwards by thousands, by myriads, by generations. Infinite was my agitation, my mind tossed as it seemed upon the billowy ocean and weltered upon the weltering waves. May 1818. Every night I have been transported into Asiatic scenery. I know not whether others share in my feelings on this point, but I have often thought that if I were compelled to forego England and to live in China, among Chinese manners and modes of life and scenery, I should go mad. It contributes much to these feelings that Southeastern Asia is, and has been for thousands of years, the part of Earth most swarming with human life, the great officina gentium. Man is a weed in those regions. The vast empires, also, into which the enormous population of Asia has always been cast, give a further sublimity to the feelings associated with all Oriental names or images. In China, over and above what it has in common with the rest of Southern Asia, I am terrified by the modes of life, by the manners, by the barrier of utter abhorrence placed between myself and them, by counter-sympathies deeper than I can analyze. I could sooner live with lunatics, with vermin, with crocodiles or snakes. All this, and much more than I can say, the reader must enter into before he can comprehend the unimaginable horror which these dreams of Oriental imagery and mythological tortures impressed upon me. Under the connecting feeling of tropical heat and vertical sunlights, I brought together all creatures, birds, beasts, reptiles, all trees and plants, usages and appearances that are found in all tropical regions, and assembled them together in China or Hindustan. From kindred feelings, I soon brought Egypt and her gods under the same law. I was stared at, hooted at, grinned at, chattered at, by monkeys, by parakeets, by cockatoos. I ran into pagodas and was fixed for centuries at the summit, or in secret rooms. I was the idol, I was the priest, I was worshipped, I was sacrificed. I fled from the wrath of Brahma through all the forests of Asia. Vishnu hated me. Shiva lay in wait for me. I came suddenly upon Isis and Osiris. I had done a deed, they said, which the ibis and the crocodile trembled at. Thousands of years I lived and was buried in stone coffins with mummies and sphinxes, in narrow chambers at the heart of eternal pyramids. I was kissed with cancerous kisses by crocodiles, and was laid confounded with all unutterable abortions amongst reeds and nilotic mud. Some slight abstraction I thus attempt of my Oriental dreams, which filled me always with such amazement at the monstrous scenery that horror seemed absorbed for a while in sheer astonishment. Sooner or later came a reflux of feeling that swallowed up the astonishment and left me not so much in terror as in hatred and abomination of what I saw. Over every form and threat and punishment and dim, sightless incarceration brooded a killing sense of eternity and infinity. Into these dreams only it was, with one or two slight exceptions, that any circumstances of physical horror entered. All before had been moral and spiritual terrors. But here the main agents were ugly birds, or snakes, or crocodiles, especially the last. The cursed crocodile became to me the object of more horror than all the rest. I was compelled to live with him, and, as was always the case in my dreams, for centuries. Sometimes I escaped and found myself in Chinese houses. All the feet of the tables, sofas, etc., soon became instinct with life. The abominable head of the crocodile and his leering eyes looked out at me, multiplied into 10,000 repetitions, and I stood loathing and fascinated. So often did this hideous reptile haunt my dreams that many times the very same dream was broken up in the very same way. I heard gentle voices speaking to me. I hear everything when I'm sleeping. And instantly I awoke. It was broad noon, and my children were standing hand in hand at my bedside, come to show me their colored shoes or new frocks, or to let me see them dressed for going out. No experience was so awful to me, and at the same time so pathetic, as this abrupt translation from the darkness of the infinite to the gaudy summer air of highest noon, and from the unutterable abortions of miscreated, gigantic vermin to the sight of infancy and innocent human natures. Now, at last, I had become awestruck at the approach of sleep, under the condition of visions so afflicting and so intensely lifelike as those which persecuted my phantom-haunted brain. More and more, also, I felt violent palpitations in some internal region, such as are commonly but erroneously called palpitations of the heart, being, as I suppose, referable exclusively to derangements in the stomach. These were evidently increasing rapidly in frequency and in strength. Naturally, therefore, on considering how important my life had become to others besides myself, I became alarmed, and I paused, seasonably, but with a difficulty that is past all description. Either way, it seemed as though death had, in military language, thrown himself astride of my path. Nothing short of mortal anguish, in a physical sense, it seemed, to wean myself from opium. Yet, on the other hand, death through overwhelming nervous terrors, death by brain fever or by lunacy, seemed too certainly to besiege the alternative course. Fortunately, I had still so much of firmness left as to face that choice, which, with most of instant suffering, showed in the far distance a possibility of final escape. This possibility was realized. I did accomplish my escape. The moral of the narrative is addressed to the opium eater. If he is taught to fear and tremble, enough has been effected. But he may say that the issue of my case is at least a proof that opium, after an 18 years' use and an 8 years' abuse of its powers, may still be renounced, and that he may chance to bring to the task greater energy than I did, or that, with a stronger constitution, he may obtain the same results with less. This may be true. I would not presume to measure the efforts of other men by my own. Heartily I wish him more resolution. Heartily I wish him an equal success. Nevertheless, I had motives external to myself, which he may unfortunately want, and these supplied me with conscientious supports, such as merely selfish interest might fail in supplying to a mind debilitated by opium. Lord Bacon conjectures that it may be as painful to be born as to die. That seems probable. And during the whole period of diminishing the opium, I had the torments of a man passing out of one mode of existence into another, and liable to the mixed or the alternate pains of birth and death. The issue was not death, but a sort of physical regeneration. And I may add that ever since, at intervals, I have had a restoration of more than youthful spirits. One memorial of my former condition nevertheless remains. My dreams are not calm. The dread swell and agitation of the storm have not wholly subsided. The legions that encamped in them are drawing off, but not departed. My sleep is still tumultuous, and like the gates of paradise to our first parents when looking back from afar, it is still, in the tremendous line of Milton, with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms.